Right, we're going to get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program, The Case of Lizzie Borden and Other Writings by Elizabeth Garver Jordan. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the public libraries in Ashland, Bedford, Brookline, Natick, Needham, and Tewksbury for partnering with us on this event. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A. Copies of the book will be available for purchase through Bookends. I'll put that link into the chat a little later. You can also borrow a copy from the library. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Lori Harrison-Kahan, a Lexington resident, is a professor in the English department at Boston College and has received multiple awards for recovering forgotten literary works by women. Jean Carr is a writer, editor, and scholar who teaches in the writing program at Manhattanville University. Most recently, she was senior editor for ideas and planning for CNN Opinion. Lori and Jane, thank you both for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I hope that many of you will have questions to share with us. Jane and I are really thrilled to be here with all of you tonight, and we wanted to thank Cary Memorial Library, which is my hometown library, as well as all the other libraries that Helen mentioned that are co-sponsoring tonight's event. And I realize that National Library Week is still a couple of weeks away. It's coming up in April. But in the times that we're in now, it seems that every week is an occasion to celebrate and appreciate and support our public libraries for the vital role that they play in our community. So it's really special for us to be gathered here virtually with all of you through the public library system. So I thought that I would kick things off by just saying a little bit about the genre of our book, which is a Penguin Classics edition of the writings of Elizabeth Garver Jordan. And then I'll pass things over to Jane, who will talk a bit about who Jordan was, what her connection to the Lizzie Borden case is, and then I will talk a little bit as well about Jordan's career as a fiction writer in particular. So many of you may be familiar with Penguin Classics, these iconic black spine books. Many of us were assigned works like The Great Gatsby and Moby Dick in our high school English and college courses, maybe in these Penguin Classic editions. And recently, Penguin has been making an effort to rethink what we mean when we say classic. And in particular, there's been a real commitment on the part of Penguin Random House to repopulating the canon, to thinking past the white male writers like Fitzgerald and Melville towards the work of women writers and other marginalized writers. And our book on Elizabeth Garver Jordan is very much part of that effort, as is another work you see up on your screen right now, The Portable Feminist Reader, which is edited by Roxane Gay, and fittingly was published just today in time for Women's History Month. And I am very appreciative of all you who are gathered with us right now, because I'm aware that Roxane Gay is simultaneously speaking about the Portable Feminist Reader here in Cambridge tonight. This particular edition of Jordan's writings is divided into 4 parts, which you see listed up on your screen, and the table of contents will give you more detail about what's included in each of those parts. When Jane and I put this collection together, it was very important for us to represent multiple stages and aspects of Jordan's career. She was, as Jane is going to discuss, extremely prolific in multiple genres. 2 of those genres are journalism and fiction. So our first section focuses on Jordan's work as a journalist, in particular her reporting for the New York World. Then we have 2 sections that are devoted to her career as a fiction writer, and a final section that focuses on her work as an editor and as a literary activist. So that section contains excerpts from a book called The Story of a Pioneer, which is the autobiography of a suffrage leader, the Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, that Jordan commissioned as an editor and co-authored as well. And I think Jane's going to talk a little bit more about our efforts to make Jordan's work as an editor visible, because the editorial work tends to remain invisible. So this project is what we call in our field a work of feminist literary recovery, meaning that we're recovering the work of a writer who has fallen out of the canon, whose career has largely been obscured, which is one of the reasons most of you probably have not heard of Elizabeth Garver Jordan before. And so this meant going back into the archives, going to Jordan's papers, which are at the New York Public Library, going back to microfilm, which some of you may remember using, and using other digital tools and databases to actually recover all of the writing that Jordan did throughout her career. Now, she was an extremely prolific writer, and there's no way that a single collection could reprint all of her writings, so that we had to carefully curate and select the pieces to include in this particular collection. And an important part of recovery work is not just giving readers these pieces, but also contextualizing them. So Jane and I wrote an introduction to this edition, which gives background on Jordan and key biographical information. And then each of the 4 sections is preceded by a headnote, which again provides background and contextualization for that section. And we were also very fortunate that the journalism historian Brooke Kroger wrote a short preface to the book, so contextualizing Jordan in terms of the careers of women journalists more broadly. So that should give you a sense of what this book is as a genre. And I now wanted to turn it over to Jane, who's going to talk a bit more about Jordan herself, and the connection to Lizzie Borden, who's a familiar name to many of you, and is mentioned in the title of our collection.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you to the Carey Memorial Library and all of the area libraries for sponsoring us tonight. I echo everything that Lori said by way of thanks and by way of support. So it is my task tonight to, as best I can, introduce you to Elizabeth Garver Jordan, a rich and diverse polymath of a figure. She's born in 1865 in Milwaukee, trains as a young woman as a pianist while attending a convent school. And the school is quite significant because it features later in her short stories in ways that you'll hear about from Lori. As a young woman still in school, she considers entering the novitiate. She's brought up Catholic, of course, attending a convent school, but also had aspirations to being a writer. And her parents, initially tried to dissuade her from entering taking orders and becoming a nun. And her father, kind of wanting to play to her interests already, encourages her to pursue journalism and says, if you give this a try for a year, I'll help you. And she never looked back. She edits the women's page for a Milwaukee paper, Peck's Sun, then moves up and on to some Chicago papers, including the Chicago Tribune. She writes features before showing up. And as she puts it in her memoir, she writes a memoir that published in 1938, Three Rousing Cheers. She shows up in New York City and demands a job from the managing editor of the New York World in 1890. So this is very much a period where women are entering journalism in increasing ranks. She somewhat crosses like this with Nellie Bly, who's a name you may be familiar with, who also made her way at the New York World, becoming a well-known journalistic name. And in her years at the World, Jordan notably interviews First Lady Caroline Scott Harrison. She reports extensively from Appalachia, and she covers not just the Borden trial, but multiple sensational murder trials, 2 in particular, Borden and the Borden murder, and another one the year before in New York City. She also writes a column, True Stories of the News, where her job was, as she put it in her memoir, to dig up all of the facts back of the news leads and write each story as if it were fiction hung on its news hook. And so what she means by this is these are stories that would probably take up 1 or 2 lines, with the suggestion potentially of a tragic backstory. And we're seeing examples here of, a suicide or, some a body found with a little explanation. And so she goes, she with this column applies the techniques of fiction to really do the reporting to flesh out what actually happened and to narrate this story in a way that would be widely accessible and readable to as many of the world's readers as possible. So, in addition to this reporting, she starts compiling her stories into her first published volumes later in the 1890s. She works tirelessly as an editor alongside rising to assistant Sunday editor in 1897. And her profile during these years as both a fiction writer, as Lori will describe, and as a professional editorial persona is very much on the rise, leading her to, in 1900, depart the New York world and become the editor-in-chief, the third editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, still a well-known magazine for women. And so she spends 13 years there, editorial columns, aplenty, building relationships, and really fostering relationships with the foundational writers of the day. And they amplify her as really a foundational figure and literary tastemaker. And she consistently during this time elevates women's voices in public, continuing to publish a variety of short fiction of her own during this time. And so, that's a very quick and dirty overview of a quite significant chapter in her life. But to kind of keep things moving, Hearst acquires Harper's Bazaar in 1913, and Jordan decides to remain with Harper and Brothers. And so she kind of breaks off to become a literary advisor, which is the period that Lori was describing when she worked with the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw. She becomes kind of a literary scout of sorts. She signs the first novel of Sinclair Lewis. She works with Zona Gale and Dorothy Canfield Fisher. And of course, then she also acquires and co-writes Anna Howard Shaw's memoir, which is significant not only for its editorial importance, but is also significant because at this time, Jordan is very much involved in working in the suffrage movement as an activist in New York State. She's involved in the unsuccessful 1915 referendum campaign, and then is even more so involved in the successful campaign in 1917 that, will connect to how Lori and I both describe our initial comings to Jordan as a figure. And so throughout the 19 teens, she channels all of her, hard fostered literary connections and editorial contacts and professional reputation as an editor to advocate for votes for women, particularly in New York. And following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Jordan transitions to a career as a newspaper columnist and ultimately as a mystery novelist, putting those years covering true crime to work in a different milieu in which she was equally prolific to the tune of nearly a novel a year until 1945, which is 2 years before she passes away. So if we can move the slide forward. So I touched on this a little bit, but I want to say a word about Jordan as a journalist. While reporting for the world, she displays this ability to identify with and then really fuse the day's demand for sympathy and emotion with clear-eyed storytelling that uses literary techniques quite liberally. I like to think of this as her own brand of emotional realism, and it defines much of her work, including the examples that you see here. The first is Jessie Adamson's suicide, one of her early true stories of the news columns, in which Jordan supplies a rich narrative context for, these sorts of short items. She uses these columns not only to sort of spin out the story of things that would be, buried on page 14, perhaps, but she also devotes space and gives voice to urban society's most vulnerable members. She writes about immigrants, women, the disabled, and the working poor. And she makes marginalized more visible to multiple kinds of readers. And it's worth noting this column is published in the same year as Jacob Riis' How the Other Half Lives, and both speak to the documentation of the kinds of squalid conditions in urban life that helped to spur a culture of reform that was quite prevalent at the time. And on the right, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, you have an image of Lizzie's Dark Day, which is one of roughly 20 articles that Jordan publishes while covering the 1893 trial of Lizzie Borden in Fall River, Massachusetts. She's one of the only women who is sent to cover it. I believe there were 3, and the world actually has to petition the Massachusetts Supreme Court to include reporters who are not from Massachusetts. There was obviously a great deal of demand for seats for journalists to cover the proceedings. And as one historian of the trial has pointed out, since these New York papers, and New York was then, as it is now, sort of the center of national media, none of them were initially granted slots to cover the trial, which took place in New Bedford, of course. And so the world had to petition, the Massachusetts Supreme Court on behalf of Elizabeth Garver Jordan. So, you have at this moment, prior to the turn of the 20th century, one of the largest newspapers in the country petitioning a court on behalf of a female reporter to cover these proceedings, which is quite significant. And it, as Lori will describe, and as we note in the book, it does become, one of the defining moments of her career. So, if we want to skip forward. So to get into the Borden of it all, we thought it was really important in making the selections of what to include in the volume from this period in Jordan's career. We thought it was very important to highlight how, in Jordan's hands, Lizzie Borden becomes more than a sensational headline. She becomes a fully fledged woman whose story is told in the round. What she wore, what she read, her comportment and body language in the courtroom and outside it, her facial expressions and how they could be decoded, how she used her fan to cover her face at different times, and, not just Borden, but the other attendees. So we get very rich portraits of the way the women spectators who lined up around the block to the courthouse to get into the proceedings. And most of Jordan's reports, as was the convention of the time, were unsigned, but several of them do actually give her a tagline, which would have been certainly quite significant for any reporter of the time. And so I've included a selection here on the slide of one that is, continues to stand out to me. And this is the real Lizzie Borden. And I thought that I would just read a little bit from this, both on the slide, and I'll read a little bit beyond it as well. There are 2 Lizzie Bordens. One of them is the very real and very wretched woman who is now on trial for her life in the little courthouse at New Bedford, Mass. The other is a journalistic creation, skillfully built up by correspondence and persistently dangled before the eyes of the American people until it has come to be regarded as a genuine personality. This last creature is a human sphinx, a thing without heart or soul. It is large and coarse and heavy. It committed a ghastly double murder in Fall River last August, and it is now stolidly awaiting the result of a trial for that crime. It deserves no sympathy and receives none. This is the Lizzie Borden of the press. And so we get sections in this very long piece about the way Lizzie Borden holds her mouth, the way she uses her feet. We get a description not only of the sort of fashion status of her shoes, but also how the different ways in which her feet move and how she scrapes them along the floor and moves them in relation to her chair at different moments in the proceeding. What we're essentially getting is a profoundly observant, close reading of how Lizzie Borden's body changes depending on what's going on around her. And it's certainly something that Jordan's identity as a woman, but also her ability to, observe everything from, covert glances to the way a woman would hold her body or move her feet around, and even just assessing, what her shoes are made out of, and what they look like. These are all things that are sort of particular to her and quite different from the other ways that Borden was written about as a kind of inscrutable figure of potential violence by some of the other journalists of the time. From this piece, I also want to read just a bit of a paragraph about the women that line up around the block of the courthouse to try to get in to observe. So Jordan writes that behind the prisoner was a wooden railing. Behind and around that railing are the newspaper correspondents. Back of them, Filling every available inch of space and banked against the walls like an exhibit of poppies and dahlias at the flower show sit the wives and mothers and maiden ladies of Fall River and New Bedford. These women form one of the most interesting exhibits in the case. Untrammeled by logic and unmoved by sympathy, they judge and gloat. They wear sailor hats and russet leather shoes and brilliant red and pink and blue blouses. It is said in New Bedford that ex-Governor Robinson calls every feminine garment a blouse, regardless of its appearance or use. The ex-governor's mistake is entirely justifiable and natural. He has seen nothing else in this town. He gets a foreshortened view of those blouses, and that is all. If there are other garments worn, he has to take them on trust. And then she starts to, offer other portraits and portrayals of these women, but more than anything else, she gives us a sense of who they are in an embodied way. They're not just eyeballs looking at the proceedings, and that's quite significant as well. Um, so this is the real Lizzie Borden is in many ways a story of the cultural legend that we all know by, the rhyme, Lizzie Borden, 40 wax, all, and so on, but from a totally different perspective, a perspective that puts her humanity at the center and obviously acknowledges things that you can't know. She wasn't given access to interview Borden, for instance, but she, we come away with a real sense of Jordan's devotion to narrative detail, her knowledge of women's fashion, and her willingness to blend journalism with the use of literary device. That is quite a significant moment, I think, both in Jordan's career and in our understanding of Lizzie Borden. So if we could go forward. So what you see here are two pieces that are, or images and quotes from two pieces that are also included in the book. And as it's Women's History Month, I did want to mention these two noteworthy magazine features that both focus on Jordan's role as an emerging but increasingly well-known woman journalist and editor. So her skill and her daring, as well as her kind of sharp eye for what made for good and newsworthy stories, earned her, as I said, a great deal of respect from the editors at the New York World, and she's promoted to assistant Sunday editor in 1897. It's a rare position for a woman, and it makes her instantly more visible in journalistic circles. And so these two pieces, the newspaper woman's story in 1893 and what it means to be a newspaper woman in 1899, reflect her visibility, but also her commitment to supporting fellow professional women and increasing their presence in the field of journalism. And in these pieces, you see places where she offers advice to women interested in newspaper careers. And she also documents her own experiences and shares practical guidance. And thinking about where and how she expresses different versions of her experience will become relevant in Lori's discussion of some of her fiction as well. Certainly this idea, they're published at different moments in her career, these two pieces. But certainly, I think it's worth noting that writing in Ladies' Home Journal on the cusp of a new century, as she's poised to begin this next chapter in her career as the editor of Harper's Bazaar, she predicts that, quote, the newspaper woman of the 20th century will be a new type, and much will be expected of her. She must stand or fall by the same tests that are given to the man at the desk beside hers in the city room. I think we can go ahead to the Harper's Bazaar. So I wanted to give you at least a little bit of a visual introduction to what the magazine would have looked like in the era in which Jordan was the editor. And she asserts a really strong editorial voice in her years at Harper's. During her years there, the magazine expands its literary offerings, it increases its books coverage, and it adds more color plates and illustrations to its pages. And Jordan spends a lot of time retaining established writers from the Harper's universe, such as William Dean Howells and Mark Twain, while recruiting additional voices, including Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Henry James, Mary Heaton Vorse. So this is a little bit of just a visual introduction to some of the work that she was doing when she was at Harper's Bazaar. And we can go forward. So here's one of my favorite images in all of the, from all of the ones that we include in the talks that we do, because it gives you a visual reference point for how involved editors and journalists were in the fight for women's suffrage in the 19 teens. So what you see here is a committee of editors and journalists marching in the streets in a suffrage parade in New York City in 1911. Now, this is not a picture of Jordan, but it's a representation that captures her deep involvement in the central work that editors and journalists were performing as a part of this effort in the 19 teens. So they're central to keeping the suffrage movement in the headlines, first of all, of course. They're part of the public actions that you see here in the parade. But then if you click forward, thank you. You also see in this, this is letterhead with the inclusion of various councils and committees as a part of the 1915 campaign for suffrage for women in New York. And you see that there's a contributing editors subcommittee. And there are a number of writers who might be familiar. There's certainly many of the writers with whom Jordan worked. And then, of course, Jordan herself. So the intensification of this campaign comes at a crucial moment in Jordan's career, where she's an editor of she had been the editor of a leading women's magazine, had just left, is building this entire other career as a literary advisor and tastemaker from Harper and Brothers. And this moment of transition and power in her public persona becomes a key element to her activism. So as I said, there are statewide referenda for women's suffrage in both 1915 and 1917 in New York. And her involvement in 1915, when the referendum fails, could have ended there, but it doesn't. She goes on to make a project that becomes central to the 1917 campaign as well. And a big part of how she got there, go ahead. As we said, is her involvement in this book, The Story of the Pioneer. It's one of her most significant projects during this period. And she called Shaw perhaps probably the best woman speaker America ever had. Shaw is the longtime president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which the state arm of which was central to the 1915 campaign. So Jordan spends years trying to get Shaw to write her autobiography. Shaw says, "I'm too busy. I'm, a committed activist. I'm traveling the country. I'm lecturing all the time." And then she suffers an ankle injury and has to kind of lay up for a few weeks to recuperate. And Jordan hires a secretary, hightails it to where Shaw is staying, and they meet daily to talk things through. And essentially from these meetings comes this book. Their collaboration is this important gesture of political solidarity, and also they're an affirmation of their shared status as public women, a status that is mediated and made possible by Jordan's capacity and her public persona as an editor. So if you want to skip forward. Yep. Okay. So here we have Jordan in a different editorial context, what we call the composite editor. So as I said, the campaign in 1915 fails. In 1917, Jordan is central to a publicity project called the Suffrage Composite Novel. It results in what you see here, The Sturdy Oak, a composite novel of American politics. And you see by 14 American authors. And so the composite novel is sort of like a game of literary telephone, where one person starts a chapter, then they hand it off to the next person who writes a chapter, and they hand it off to the next person who writes a chapter, and so on. So you have a general, narrative outline that you want to follow, but basically you only see the chapter that the person before you has written. And so she had done this before at Harper's Bazaar in a project that she co-edited with William Dean Howells, The Whole Family. You can see here that some of the authors who are included are, kind of brilliantly included in this really interesting cover image with like spokes on a wheel. So she's familiar with the form, and she decides, I can take advantage of this form by recruiting writers that people have heard of, but also people who I know are sympathetic to this cause. And she sees middlebrow fiction as her gateway here, because she, like some of the other activists in the 17 campaign, realized that in order to win, they have to win over men. And so this book is fascinating because it's essentially got all of these really interesting subplots, and it, moves quite well, and it's very readable. But at its core, it has a sympathetic male character who experiences a conversion from being an anti-suffrage voter to being a suffrage voter. And so, it's a form actually that continues. If anyone has read 14 Days, compiled recently by Margaret Atwood and Douglas Preston, it continues. But it's really a testament to, the book is serialized in a publication and then is published in novel form, right, just in time for the campaign, which is, of course, ultimately successful. So, we see her bringing her contacts and her years of forging literary taste to the battlefield for women's votes, and they are ultimately successful. So if you want to skip forward, I'm mindful of time and I want to have a chance to hear from Lori about so many interesting things. But I want to just say a word about making editorial labor visible. So as Lori said, despite being a prolific writer of fiction and other genres, Jordan's place in literary and cultural history has thus far primarily rested on, and in a very small way, on her editorial work, both in, I would say, academic circles, on the Sturdy Oak, and then also in her Times obituary in 1947, she's noted as having, and rightly so, she did, discovered Sinclair Lewis, but she's known primarily through editorial work done with other writers, not on her own steam. And so this kind of speaks, as Lori said, to what critic Sarah Blackwood has often described as the care work of editing, in which often gendered labor is rendered, even if it involves published words, largely invisible. So as editors ourselves, I'll say, we too know well how easy it is and how difficult it can be to be erased, the erasures that often come with that role. And so we thought very deeply about how to include Jordan's editorial life in this volume. So certainly by speaking, writing and including material about her activism, because of how central her role as an editor was to her public voice as an activist. Certainly, we, for instance, did not include editors' columns from Harper's Bazaar because those are all fully digitized. And we did include particular stories, several chapters from The Story of a Pioneer. But then we also thought about, other ways that we can, more literally make her work visible. So as Lori said, Jordan's papers are at the New York Public Library, and I, had been through them several times. And one of the images that had always stood out to me is this title page from The Sturdy Oak. And you can see at the top left that she's initialed it. These are obviously the page proofs, and she's initialed it by saying, "Okay, EJ." And, I was always really struck just by seeing her editorial hand. It's really one of the only places in her papers where we see this. And so when I was thinking about this and talking to Lori about it, and thanks to the brilliance of our cover designer, Michelle Thompson, shout out, also to our editor, Elizabeth Vode at Penguin Classics, Jordan's editorial hand also appears on our cover. If you look in the center beneath her collar, the collar of her dress, that "Okay, EJ" appears in blue. And so alongside the names of Lori and myself and Brooke, who have written about her and have put this volume together to make her work much more a part of how we talk about the history of women in fiction, the history of women in journalism, and certainly the long history of women performing incredibly significant editorial labors. We also wanted the visual reference to her editorial labor to be at the center, quite literally, of our work. So there it is, you can see it. And I will now turn it over to Lori.
Okay, thanks so much, Jane. So Jane gave us a sense of an overview of Jordan's career. I'm going to focus a bit more for the next 10 minutes on her career as a fiction writer. But I think one of the things you're going to see as I speak is that the various parts of her career are not necessarily distinct. You'll notice the impact of her journalism and her literary activism on her fiction and her editorial persona as well on her fiction. Jane talked about how in her journalism, she was borrowing techniques that many people associated with fiction as well. And this slide is a nice place for me to start, because The Sturdy Oak, as one of the few books of Jordan's that remained in print, was my own introduction to Jordan. And I was teaching this book, The Sturdy Oak, in a course at Boston College in the fall of 2017. This was a course called Human Rights and American Women's Writing that went from 1850 to 1920. So it went up until the 19th Amendment, when women got the right to vote, and explored the ways that women used literature in all its forms to have a voice at a time when they did not have a vote. And often I would end that course with The Sturdy Oak. And students were really fascinated. Although Jordan did not write any of the chapters, she writes the preface and she edits it, and they were really fascinated by Jordan's role and wanted to learn more about her. And at the same time, when I was teaching this course in the fall of 2017, that was the beginning of the Me Too movement. And students began to see certain resonances between the works that we were studying in the course, including The Sturdy Oak, and the issues that were coming up around Me Too, particularly around giving voice to issues of sexual violence and sexual harassment in the workplace, which is one of the subplots of The Sturdy Oak. So that led a small group of students to get interested in reading more of Jordan, which I did along with them. And what we discovered was that actually that what I call the seeds of Me Too are present throughout Jordan's writing, that she was often in her fiction writing speaking about women's experiences in the workplace. So I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but I just want to talk briefly about her breakthrough moment, the moment where we could really locate where she begins to pivot to a career as a fiction writer. Her career as a fiction writer, a journalist, and an editor and activist all overlap. But in 1894, she publishes her first work of fiction, a short story called Ruth Herrick's Assignment, which she publishes in Cosmopolitan magazine, which you could see up here. And when this story came out, it was quite a sensation. I have to apologize and say that the only way to talk about this story is to spoil the ending for you. So I'm, cover your ears if you don't want to hear it, but I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Many of Jordan's works of fiction center on experiences of women journalists, so fictional characters who serve as alter egos for her. And in this one, the journalist is named Ruth Herrick. And in this story, Ruth Herrick is assigned to cover a woman who has been accused of murder. And the editor sends her to conduct a jailhouse interview with this woman who's on trial. And during the course of that interview, the woman confesses to Jordan that she did indeed, in this case, it was she murdered her husband. And the journalist decides that she's going to suppress the confession rather than get the big newspaper scoop that would result if she was able to publish this. And the reason she makes that decision is over the course of the interview, as she gets to know those women, she finds out that the woman had suffered years of domestic violence. So when this story comes out in Cosmopolitan, keep in mind it's a work of fiction, people who read the story thought that Lizzie Borden had confessed to Elizabeth Jordan, even though, right, there's a bit of a plot change. Lizzie Borden was accused of killing her father and stepmother. Here it was a woman accused of killing her husband. People read this as if there was that underlying element of truth. Jordan herself claims that she began working on the story before the Lizzie Borden trial, and she did not necessarily see the two connected, but her audience certainly did. So this was kind of this big breakthrough moment where she's publishing the sensational piece of fiction. This leads her to publish her first book, which is called Tales of the City Room, which is a collection of stories that includes Ruth Herrick's Assignment, which had been previously published. And all of the stories in this collection focus on the experiences of women journalists. So she's using fiction as a way to explore what was going on in the newsroom when she herself was a journalist, what it was like to be one of the few women in that male-dominated environment. She goes on to publish a series of stories called the May Iverson stories, which were published in magazines and then also in book form. She ends up publishing 3 May Iverson books. And as you'll see, Jane just covered some of her autobiography. The elements of her autobiography come up in these fictional stories. So we could really read May Iverson as Jordan's fictional alter ego. The early stages, the first book, May Iverson, her book, focuses on May's experiences growing up and being educated at a convent school. So it clearly has that overlap with Jordan's own life experiences. Then she publishes a second book called May Iverson Tackles Life in 1912, which focuses more on her teenage years at the convent school. And then a third book called May Iverson's Career, in which May graduates from the convent school and begins a career in journalism. And it's in May Iverson's career that we could really see her exploring those experiences again through fiction of what it was like to be a woman in this male-dominated space. And in particular, this May Iverson's career contains a number of moments that we could think of as Me Too movement moments, even though at the time, of course, she didn't have that language. Even the very term sexual harassment or sexual violence or gendered violence were not terms that were available to her. But what she's describing are very much those experiences that we would call sexual harassment today. So I'll just read you the short, I want to keep it brief because I want to get to the questions. So I'm just going to read you the short bit that I have up here on the screen, which comes from a 1914 story called The Cry of the Pack, in which May Iverson kind of pauses each of the stories in the book, focuses on her covering a different assignment for the paper, the fictional paper that she works for that's called The Searchlight. But here she pauses to kind of reflect on what it's like to be in this gendered environment. Besides, a new and terrible thing was happening to me. I was becoming afraid, not of work, but of men. I never had been afraid of anything before. From the time we were laid in our cradles, my father taught my brother Jack and me not to be afraid. The worst of my fear now was that I didn't know exactly why I felt it, and there was no one I could go to and ask about it. And then later she describes this experience of sexual harassment, which one of the male reporters is constantly kind of coming up to her desk and draping himself over the desk. And, you know, the language that she uses, that he's constantly trying to take her out on a date. And then she talks about the kind of psychic trauma of this repeated experience. And this is how she describes a dream that she has. He was always a snake in the dream, a fat, disgusting, lazy snake, slowly squirming over the ground near me with his bulging green eyes on my face. And what's really interesting, if you go on to read this story and other stories by Jordan, is that she takes care to create a range of characters. So this particular character that she's talking about, the sexual harasser, is clearly depicted as a predator, but she has another character in that same story, the editor, who is just kind of the kind of, he almost treats her as if she's just no different from the male reporter, doesn't really give her the time of day or any special attention. And then she has a third male character in that story who kind of intervenes here, and he's the figure of the male ally. So she's giving a range of possibilities for the way that men behaved in the workplace, and she does the same for women as well, so that often her women in these stories, these female reporters, will all choose different paths. Some of them are really determined to have this career and they don't want to marry, they remain single, as Jordan herself did. Others try to balance career and family. Others will ultimately leave the workforce and choose family. So we see her really exploring these multiple options throughout these works of fiction. And then, as Jane mentioned, Jordan went on to take her experience as a true crime reporter and turn those into fiction as well. So she wrote a number of mystery novels, including the 2 you see up here, The Blue Circle and The Lady of Pentlands. These are almost entirely out of print and really difficult to get a hold of. It took me many months of interlibrary loan to get my hands on The Lady of Pentlands, which is a great read. It's incredibly suspenseful and also really fascinating because, like so many of her works, it features a single professional heroine. And I just wanted to give you visuals for a couple of other aspects of Jordan's career that Jane mentioned. She was so prolific, but also was always trying her hands at different genres. She wrote a Broadway play, The Lady from Oklahoma, which you're seeing up here, which was produced in 1911 and explored some of the themes that pervade her career. In particular, makeover culture and beauty culture was one of the topics that she was interested in, both in her fiction writing, her playwriting, and also as an editor, because she edited a woman's magazine. And then here's a visual of her autobiography, Three Rousing Cheers, which Jane mentioned as well, which was published in 1938. And this is how we actually know that many of the experiences that she talks about in her fiction were based on her real life, because in 1938, she finally, in nonfiction, talks about some of those experiences that she had in the newsroom in terms of sexual harassment and gendered violence. So the fictional stories that I talked about were very much based on her own career. And then I just thought I would wrap up by saying a word about Jordan's legacy. So what you're seeing here is the headline of her career in the New York Times, of her obituary in the New York Times. It's significant that she even had an obituary in the New York Times. Many famous women did not. There's actually a New York Times column that's run recently called Overlooked that has obituaries for women who never got obituaries in their time. In Jordan's case, she did. But I just want to point out that the title of the headline of the obituary focuses on her career as a journalist, and the subheadline mentions her career as an editor of Harper's Bazaar and the fact that she is defined in many ways by this famous male writer who she discovered, Sinclair Lewis. So it leaves out so many aspects of her career, and in particular, her career as a fiction writer, which is one of the reasons that Jane and I wanted to devote 2 sections of our book to her fiction, with the hope that now that will be a key part of her legacy. And the image you're seeing here as well is of Jordan's gravestone, which is located in Florence, Massachusetts, so in Western Massachusetts. And a couple of months ago, Jane and I had the opportunity to do a book event out in Western Massachusetts, and we're able to visit the gravestone as well as a house that's still standing where Jordan spent many of her summers. And that work of being out there doing field work led to some interesting new revelations that we'd also be happy to speak about in the Q&A. But given that we only have about 15 minutes left, we should probably turn to those questions right now. I did see actually one question in the chat. This is a good moment for me to say, if you have a question, please post it. But I did see one question come in the chat already, which was, is there an audiobook? And indeed, there is an audiobook. This is, you're seeing on the screen information about that audiobook. We have a professional narrator, Barry Kreinick, who reads all of Jordan's writings on the audiobook. Jane and I had the opportunity to read the parts that we wrote, and Brooke Kroger reads her introduction. So the audiobook, I think, just beautifully brings Jordan to life in a way that we'd never expected would happen when we began this project. And I also love the fact that it involves this collaboration among 4 women. You get to hear 4 women's voices, which feels very much in the spirit of Jordan's collaborative efforts throughout her career as a writer, as an editor, and as an activist.
Thank you, Lori and Jane. And so we do have some questions. Kim would like to know, do you touch on her stunt covering the Mary Alice Livingston case? This is how I discovered her.
Jane, do you know anything about that?
I don't. I saw a question in the chat also about the other murder trial that I alluded to, and that was of Carlisle Harris, who was accused, he was a medical student who was accused of murdering his wife, ultimately convicted and executed. I'm not familiar with Mary Alice Livingston, other than to know vaguely of, I believe it was certainly a sort of well-known Gilded Age killing in, I think, the mid-1890s. I want to say 1895. But clearly, we have more to learn about.
This is what we love about doing these events, because we've gotten so many great questions that have actually led to new research leads. So thank you.
100%. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. I saw the question, ever marry and have children as well. And I mentioned she remains single throughout her life. Jane, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. She very early on in her life kind of creates a blended family of found friends who become family, and sort of incorporates her blood relatives into that family. So she forges a community in New York and also here in Florence with two other professional women. Martha Hill Cutler, whose family owned this home in Florence, and Harriet Beardley Prescott. Martha was a painter and a graphic designer, and Harriet Prescott was a librarian at Columbia, and they lived together throughout their lives. And after the death of Jordan's father, her mother comes to stay with them and lives with him them for the rest of her life. And her sister and brother-in-law also live with them off and on. Um, and so they do ultimately raise the three of women together with also Jordan's sister, raise a Ward who had been adopted by Cutler's mother shortly before her mother passed away. And so that woman has descendants. And so they do have descendants. They did not give birth to children. And there's some really interesting biographical work being done on Jordan, in addition to our recovery and contextualization work by a scholar, Sharon Harris, who's an emerita professor from the University of Connecticut, who has a biography of Jordan coming out. Is it next year, Lori?
Yes, I think in about a
Okay.
year. Yeah.
So it's a really exciting time to be working on Jordan. So there is some suggestion that Jordan did have at least one queer love relationship during her lifetime. But we're still, there's still research being done and we're still finding out more. So it's a really exciting time. And I think it's a really, given some of the work that's been done by Anne Friedman and Amina Toussaint on, the idea of big friendship in women's lives. I think there's also some really exciting, in the study of the significance of female friendship across many disciplines. I think it's a really exciting time to be looking at this kind of, built family formation that they all created together as well.
And I think it's also important that in many of her fictional stories, she's representing alternative family structures.
Yes.
There are
Yes.
there are several, I know there's at least one in our collection where they're about women, professional women who are single women who are living together. So you're seeing, again, right, that thread between her autobiography and her fiction.
Hmm.
I saw the question from Danielle as well about will the hard to find works become easier to find? And we are hoping that that's the case, because I think what happens with recovery projects like ours is that it often leads to new research and new interest. And I think that the relationship between our Penguin Classic Edition and this biography of Jordan that's going to come out by Sharon Harris may lead to renewed interest in the possible republication of some of these murder mysteries, because Sharon Harris is particularly interested in her career as a Golden Age mystery writer. It's a key part of the biography.
And I should say just very quickly that we, as scholars and writers, have been beneficiaries of those efforts, to make those, works and that labor visible. I mean, Sherry and I are now, I would say, certainly collaborators, hopefully friends. And she was a very big supporter of our project. But I first came to know her work as the co-editor of an edition about the importance of making women's editorial work visible, which essentially inspired my dissertation, which was how I came to first know and love Jordan. And so, I think the more that we put that kind of work into the hands of undergraduates and graduate students, they will then be inspired to go off and, find new materials, to find new ways of thinking about and contextualizing these works. And so, we are, just so grateful to be a part of that cycle.
Yes, and I should mention two other scholars as well who were really influential on our work. Mary Chapman, who had written about the sturdy oak as a suffrage text, and Karen Rogenkamp, who had done some of the initial work on her Jordan's career as a journalist and how she then transformed some of that those experiences into fiction. And all of us are part of a professional organization called the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. And we are hoping this fall at the annual conference to have a panel on Jordan where all of us will come together and speak about our past work and our developing work on Jordan. So hopefully
And that conference many years ago now, I think is where you and I first met.
That's right. Yes. That's how we connected as well through
Yes.
the Society of the Study for American Women Writers. Yes.
Out of curiosity, were there any other stories or selections that not did not make it into the book?
Yes.
Question. Our original table of contents was at least twice the length, and very quickly Penguin said you cannot produce a book of this length. So we had to make some really difficult
Yeah.
decisions about what to include. And one of the decisions we made early on was that this book really focuses on her early career, because we decided that we would only republish works that are currently in the public domain. So we did not get permissions for anything that was not in the public domain. So that means really pre-1925. And then we were also really interested in the relationship between her career as a journalist and her career as a fiction writer. So we really look for works that would have interplay, where you could see, for example, as we talked about the Lizzie Borden case, and then the kind of fictional manifestation of that in Ruth Herrick's Assignment, and a couple of other stories. So Lizzie Borden really becomes a kind of fictional thread through many of those short stories as well.
Yeah. And I would say too that we were really interested in some of the fiction that, I mean, you sort of spoke to this already in talking about the connections between journalism and fiction, but ways where we could see certain interests or investments that were deeply important across her career. So you spoke about how there are a lot of single professional women. There's also an exploration. There are many explorations of in some of the short fiction of the convent school or other sort of women only spaces where she's able to really explore that, and how she uses as you described with May Iverson, the figure of an alter ego, which was sort of a popular trope for women writers, especially women journalism writers at the time. So and for me, I think also in picking out some of the more true stories of the news, it was you know pieces that really allowed readers to see how she wielded that platform. So one of the things we talk about in the introduction is how, given her involvement in so many different genres and her focus on, audience, we sort of see her as kind of a proto-influencer. And so thinking about how, choosing among the many, 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 I mean, there are so many, examples of columns that she wrote illustrating certain realities of life in New York during that period, but the ones that really sort of speak to the kinds of characters that she sought to make more visible and to bring to life with that brand of emotional realism that she practices were the ones that we wanted most to include.
And I also want to say that we had a number of undergraduate research assistants from
Yes.
college working with us. And they did a lot of the work of digging up these stories, and then they read them all. And they advised us in terms of which stories would resonate with young people in particular today, and which ones they would want to discuss in a classroom. And one of the refrains that I heard from these students was that so many of the stories passed the Bechdel test. For those of you who know the Bechdel test, sometimes called the feminist rule, which comes from cartoonist Alison Bechdel, just in terms of the ways that women play the central role in these stories. It's about relationships between women. Men are sometimes marginalized in the stories, and women are constantly engaging in conversation and dialogue. So we wanted to emphasize that aspect of her writing as well. And I just saw that comment from Teresa about driving by the house in
Oh, I love
Northampton,
that.
it's in a very prominent location, actually across, we discovered, from the Sojourner Truth Memorial in Florence.
Oh, and just
And
to explain what the image is on the right side, I was able to go into the house, and it's called Spread Wings because it has this, incredibly intricate, beautiful carving on under the mantle in the front room.
just one last question in terms of her fiction work. Did any of those fiction work connect to a Broadway play that she wrote?
So the Broadway play, The Lady of Oklahoma, there was a lot of the themes of the Broadway play, which is very much
Yeah.
about kind of the vexed nature of beauty culture. Like, Jordan was very fashionable and was into beauty. At the same time, she realized the way that that culture could be restrictive for women. And that theme comes up in a lot of the fiction, as well as in central component of that play.
And it also comes up a lot in some of what she ends up, this is not in the book, of course, but some of the editorial writing that she does when she's at the helm of Harper's Bazaar.
She's editing a fashion magazine, right? So she has
Right,
to dabble with this
exactly.
all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Lori and Jane, for joining us today, and thank you all for being here. And just to mention again that this program is being recorded and we'll post it to the library's YouTube channel. Lots of comments coming in saying it was a fascinating conversation and they enjoyed it and learned quite a bit. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you all for being here.